So today, first, like I said, we'll go over kind of a short mini lecture about the evolving focus of social emotional learning. Then I'd like us to kind of dig into a little bit to CASEL, which is the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, which is, I feel like, kind of the closest thing that social emotional learning has to like a governing board. So we'll take a look at that, explore the website a little bit, and how they define the core competencies, which have really come to be how the field as a whole has come to take on those core competencies. Kind of like we did yesterday with defining the emotion and the intelligence, we're kind of digging a little bit to starting to look at how we, both collectively as a class and then also as individuals, are defining what social emotional learning means, because as we move forward, that will be a part of our final paper. So kind of starting to think about that, at least today, more just kind of in terms of how some of the authors and researchers in the field are envisioning it or presenting it, and kind of seeing where we fall within that, what we agree with, what we don't, where we want to take it from there. Take a break. And then before we really get into looking at kind of both the Durlac study and kind of the benefits of social emotional learning writ large, even beyond that meta-analysis, I'd like us to kind of dig into, which started in the chapter you read from the book tonight, last night, is kind of setting the purpose. Like, what is the argument behind social emotional learning? Why do we need it? Much like we would with any educational reform effort. Kind of return, finishing off looking at social emotional learning, how we want to define it, and then kind of looking forward to next week. So any questions about that, kind of where we're headed today? Or? All right. The other thing I'd like to try to experiment a little bit with today, and we'll see how it goes, is so far just in terms of technology and everything, we've been primarily discussing in whole groups. So we'll try to start infusing some smaller groups. And so please, you know, bear with me, be patient as we try to make this work with the technology. Awesome. All right. So if it's okay, if there aren't any other announcements or anything you want to like start off with right away, something really pressing that you read that you want to throw out there right now, I'll start off with a little bit of the kind of the lecture space while I still have everyone's focus and attention and we just got here. I also just wanted to let you know that I post the slides from the PowerPoints the next day onto D2L, so please, like, if there are things in here that are interesting to you, don't feel like you have to like jot things down in a hurry. They'll be posted, and the notes that kind of go along with it are there too. So and if you don't find it interesting, you don't have to look at it again. But just so you don't feel like you have to be jotting things down in a hurry. So I wanted to start off first. Actually, it'd be easier to use this probably. Perfect. So this is from the text you read last night, because this is, as we had already discussed, kind of the first book that really talked about social emotional learning and kind of put forth a definition and what it is and how we do it. So as I'm sure you noticed last night in the text, social emotional learning, as the authors defined it, was the process through which children and adults develop the skills, attitudes, and values necessary to acquire social and emotional competence. Which is great, but then you have to define what it is we mean by social emotional competence, which they go on to say that it's the ability to understand, manage, and express the social and emotional aspects of one's life in ways that enable the successful management of life tasks. And this is super interesting just in that this was 97, and they put forth like a pretty clear, succinct definition. And you'll see then what was proposed, it's an umbrella, is, so another researcher, Jonathan Cohen, who's out of Harvard and has since gone on to do more work in the school climate, school culture area, but at the time was really looking at what he termed at the time social emotional education, interestingly, not social emotional learning. But he provided a pretty clear definition of social emotional competence, but actually, let me take it back. He presented this idea that he was really hesitant at first to kind of put a specific definition on it, because he said that social emotional education or social emotional learning includes a number of positions and is culturally based, and also that if you consider its relationship to other endeavors that we've touched on a little bit, but we'll go into more detail with, like character education, school climate, school culture, that maybe we should look at this idea of social emotional learning or social emotional education as more of like an umbrella term to kind of cover all of these areas. So move past that a little bit, and social emotional learning since then has kind of taken on its own space, which I say 2 years later because he changed his mind too. This is then in 2001, he really provided a more of a definition, saying that social emotional competence is the ability or capacity to understand, manage, process, and express the social emotional aspects of one's life. And he still stuck with the social emotional education for a little while before switching over to before changing the education to learning, but said that it was the processes and methods we use to promote social emotional competencies. And also, if any of these areas as we go through are particularly interesting to you, I can send you the articles that these are pulled from, but I also wanted to kind of pull these ideas together and not have you read all of them separately. But if this is somewhere you want to go with your final paper or project, definitely let me know. I can send these your way. Okay, so this, in the new handbook that came out just recently, within the last 2 months or so. So this is the most recent definition, and this was kind of from all the big guys in the social emotional learning area. And they said, and what's interesting, I think, to me, is the twist they took on it this time is they really tried to define what SEL programming was, as opposed to just social emotional learning in and of itself. And as you can read here, they say that it involves implementing practices and policies that help children and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that can enhance personal development, establish satisfying interpersonal relationships, and lead to effective and ethical work and productivity. These include the competencies to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show caring and concern for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So this is kind of the latest idea of what social emotional learning was, or is now, excuse me. Let's see. Going next. Okay, and then coming, so again, this isn't, I just kind of want to pull together some of the more commonly used definitions here. So that's, please don't feel that you need to have all these in your head, but just as a way of kind of seeing how different people have expressed what it is. So right from Castle themselves, and it's on their website as well, is they say that social emotional learning is a process for helping children and even adults develop the fundamental skills for life effectiveness. SEL teaches the skills we all need to handle ourselves, sorry about that, our relationships and our work effectively and ethically. Questions so far? I mean, they're all kind of touching on the same ideas. There's just different slight variations and points of emphasis. This is my oversimplified and contextualized definition that I tend to use in my own research and writing, is the process and means by which we learn about ourselves as individuals and in interaction with others. You do not have to agree with that. I just that's when I at least try to explain what it is kind of in a more just simplistic term. That's where I go. So where there is confusion, or not confusion I should say, but some discrepancies around how we're actually defining social emotional learning, there is almost a universal consensus around what the core competencies are in social emotional learning, so what we're trying to achieve. And these are the 5. You see the ones in orange are related to the self, so self-management and self-awareness. We have the more social in terms of our interaction with others, social awareness and relationship skills. And one that kind of goes across the two is the responsible decision-making. So let's see. We can go through each of these kind of, and also when we explore the CASEL website after this, they go into explaining each of them. But, I mean, they're fairly self-explanatory, but basically self-awareness, which we've been talking about a lot over the last couple days already, refers to the ability to identify, label, and assess your own feelings, interests, values, strengths. And then self-management kind of builds off that once you've been able to identify them, that you're able to handle your emotions in productive ways. So what do you do with your emotion now that you're aware of it? Social awareness, conversely, of course, includes the ability to interpret others' emotions and appreciate similarities and differences. Relationship skills, referring to the promotion of positive exchanges with others. And then responsible decision-making, again, kind of crosses all of these. And they do point out as well that all of these are interrelated. I mean, so you're often not using one in isolation, but just in terms of assessment and measurement and understanding the different components of social emotional learning, they break them down into these 5 areas. Particularly in terms of assessment. So you'll see as we go through and are reading more about specific programmatic approaches that they'll often, in terms of assessment, design different components of assessment to address these different areas. Yeah, so let's, okay, that was for our next activity. Thoughts on that? It's okay if there aren't any thoughts. I just didn't know if there were any overlaps, confusion. Okay. All right. Well, I thought what we could do next is I was hoping that we could actually take a look at the CASEL website. I know not all of us have computers, and that's fine. You are welcome to use mine as well. But what I was hoping we could do now is to split into smaller groups, like 2 or 3 people, maybe someone nearby, and take a look at the CASEL website. I'm going to put up the address. And some of you may be already very familiar with the website. But if not, taking a look, regardless, kind of exploring around it, really, I would emphasize trying to focus on, I'm going to pull it up here and show you, how they define social emotional learning and what they say about the core competencies. But then if you'd like to go out and explore other sections of their website as well, I was thinking we could spend like about 10 minutes on that, exploring this with a partner, and then kind of come back together and see if there's anything that either you found clarifying or helpful, things that were confusing, if you had any new questions or ideas as a result of it. Because really, it is kind of the closest thing in CASEL that we have to a governing board of social emotional learning. And what they do is they also they put their seal of approval on certain programs, so to speak. And there's a little bit of contention around that in the sense that recently they've changed the requirements to become a CASEL-approved program, that you have to have done a randomized controlled trial to be, and shown that you're effective, to be considered for it, which is extremely expensive to do. So a little contentious in that there may be some really great programs out there that just can't afford to do a randomized controlled trial and to get that seal of approval. But all right, so I'm going to stop talking, and if you are able to pop near someone near you, and what I was going to say too to our folks joining virtually, you guys are more than welcome to look at this individually, but you're also, as a group yourself, are able to communicate together on Blue Jeans, so I can mute you all if you want to form your own group and work together and discuss, and then we'll come back together. Let's see, it's 1:32, so 1:45? Perfect. Okay. All right.
Like, why can't they be?
So it would be great if we could go around, and if there was anything kind of in your group that came up for you, whether it was something that was either something on the site that was either clarifying something you have more questions about, some new ideas or questions that came up for you, or if your topic kind of veered into a new social emotional learning space after looking at the website, that's fine too. So kind of just check in, just maybe share out, a few seconds about what you guys talked about, what came up for you. Yeah, please, thanks.
So I think, are you going to bring them back?
I didn't make them go away. They took themselves away.
They made themselves go.
So I think we're just going to have to wait for them to come back. They may have pulled out and gone to like a Google Hangout or something, which is totally, but yeah, they're late.
I'm just looking out for our cyber.
No, I really appreciate it. I was just like, I don't know. Okay, sorry. I'm so sorry.
I think, we talked, at least how I felt is that this past couple days, at least I've been thinking in the context of like elementary school.
Yeah.
If you don't sort of purchase one of these programs for your school and you just get together with, say, like your 4th grade team and you come up with something, I mean, that works, but we were talking about what it looks like at the high school level.
Mm-hmm.
With all of those different subjects and teachers and how big of an endeavor it would be to implement something. It wouldn't be as simple as 4 4th grade teachers getting together and talking about it. What does it look like and how does it function in the high school level?
That's a great question. What did you guys think? I mean, does anyone have anything to kind of add on to that in terms of like your own experience or like how you've seen it approached in high school or?
I mean, I think it's very, very difficult / almost impossible. Because even for our department, we don't all have the same planning period, or we don't, like if we want to meet, it's after school. And everyone's busy and...
Mm-hmm.
I've already been thinking about this because, how do I bring this back to the school?
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I think doing a class like this with a core group of teachers, having them start, I think teachers, especially high school teachers, love good academic articles and to seminar. And I think we're too quick to just jump in. I don't think, again, at the high school level, you will have any success if you don't have staff buy-in. And I think too often we implement programs too quickly, and if there's any suggestion that it's a top-down decision, it's not going to last. So I think I would enjoy taking a year just to marinate.
That's a great word.
And really discuss these as a group of teachers and students. We do have a teacher-directed day at 1:30 to 3 once a month, and even though that's not a lot of time, I think if you're really willing to do something that's long-lasting, because that was one, I found those articles we read last night really discouraging, to be honest with you. How many of the programs only lasted 1 year? Yeah. Well, that's typical. I've been in this game a long time, and education's very trendy.
Mm-hmm.
These articles came out again when I was graduating.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are again, and these things were not implemented, I can tell you, especially after No Child Left Behind. So I think if it's a homegrown effort and it's coming from the teachers in a philosophical way,
Mm-hmm.
I think it could work. And from the students, they have to be a part of the process.
Great. Yeah.
Well, we kind of talked about it's great to have like a 4th grade team implement one, but it talked about the longevity of
For sure.
SEL and how it needs to be more than a year. And so maybe districts having to adopt one program and implementing it district-wide, so it is K through 12.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's ideal, and
Yes.
districts don't have that much money.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is they test it for a year and they're like, well, it's not working.
Yeah.
And then they get rid of it.
Just
Like,
get
well,
rid of it.
it's not going to start working after a year because half the teachers aren't even using it yet. So then...
How do we do it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great, well, and I think too, it depends on kind of where you're hoping to go with it. If it's kind of like, I'm hoping at this point to just start my classroom and kind of say like, I'm going to do it myself and then see if I can kind of spread out from there. Or if you're hoping to start, as you mentioned, with a grade group, or if it really is a school-wide approach, to start off initially. So it's like almost like I feel like it kind of depends what the unit is that you're hoping to start with, if that makes sense. And I do think with kind of the high school system that we typically have, that we're blocked off into different disciplines and students move throughout the day, that from what makes sense in my head is that lends itself a bit more to an infused approach that's more kind of about the way students and teachers interact together than it is about a standalone curriculum or a standalone approach where you have like a set period of, because I think that becomes unrealistic, and that to have like a set period of time, say each day, and how would that rotate among the different classes, and would the same person be getting time cut out of their subject area? But I think in that kind of, in the high schools that we commonly have, like, it's a little bit different if you had like a project-based curriculum and all the disciplines were kind of melding together, but I tend to think that lends itself more to kind of having starting with either like a grade level approach to it, or starting with a school-based approach to it that kind of, as you said, starts with the teachers, and whether it's kind of a homegrown approach or whether it's having it like outside assistants come in for professional development opportunities, but then that costs money. And I think that's a lot of what kind of is going to be a constant tension when you're thinking through these, is kind of pushing up against issues of funding and also issues of time. And for me personally, I think that the infused approaches made more sense in that I wasn't taking time out of what I was doing. It just became a part of everything else, and kind of going back to that idea of emotion and cognition tying together. But I also think that social emotional learning is an interesting field, in that I think it's something that teachers often inherently do. I mean, I think it's great that it now has a name and we're calling it out and it's a specific thing. But I also think that a lot of what, as we start digging into like the programs itself and taking a look at like what you're doing from day to day, I have a feeling like you're looking like, yeah, we kind of already do this, just not explicitly in this manner. Sorry, that was tangential, and I have no idea where they are.
We're here. Can you see us?
Oh, we can't. No. Oh, you are there. Great. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, we've been here the whole time. We're here.
Wait.
We're like the ghosts in the machine.
Yeah, it's so creepy. Hold on.
Bring back.
Thanks. Sorry, I went on a little bit of a tangent there. But other things that came up for you as you went through the website, or things that came up after you looked at the website.
Can I support that infused approach?
Please.
So last summer, I was working with DPS to do a literacy curriculum for K-5, and specifically working on third grade. And one of the questions that we had as we sat there writing a unit on realistic fiction was, there's thousands and thousands of texts to choose from. And so something I suggested to the group was, why don't we come up with some kind of, character ed, whatever you want to call it, component to it. And so we ended up just selecting a bunch of texts that all had to do with making decisions, mostly with money, family, juggling, personal choices versus the what other people need. And so then all of the questions that we were able to write for that unit all kind of revolved around making those good decisions. And so it would have happened, the district ended up not using the curriculum, of course, but if they had, it would have happened during literacy block. It wouldn't have cost anything additional than the text that we were already buying. And what I had said to the rest of the team was, if we discuss this as different grade levels, we can say, okay, so in third grade, we'll talk about making decisions. Maybe fourth grade can talk about interpersonal relationships. And so if a school within itself does communicate like that, then you really can just, it doesn't cost anything extra. It just takes a lot more coordination.
That's a great example. Thank you. And I'm sorry they didn't use your curriculum.
Nah, we use it in my school.
Okay, good. Others either bouncing off that or different things that came up in your group?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, my voice is gone.
I'm so sorry, Maggie.
But there was, oh, this is not going to work. Sorry.
Okay. That's fine. No, I'm sorry. Okay, well then let's, and please, feel free to circle back if something comes up. But I'm curious a little bit about the core competencies themselves, because these 5 core competencies are, they're developed by Castle, but at this point, they're really taken as universal in the research and in the programs themselves. Sometimes you'll have programs add on a specific focus. So I know a number of you are coming here to the class through the Random Acts of Kindness Foundation, and so they kind of tack on the specific focus on kindness, but they still attend to the other 5 core competencies. So, and you'll have a number of programs like that who kind of have a specific area that they're focused in on. So I was curious, kind of just in thinking about, I'll go back to that slide, sorry. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. What do you make of these? Do you agree with these as kind of being what we are seeking to promote through social emotional learning? Are there things that you feel like you'd want to adjust or add on to or get rid of, or are there components that you feel like are not represented here? I mean, obviously, keeping in mind that this is kind of where the field is at right now, but I think it's definitely still a worthy pursuit to always kind of be going back and critiquing where we are, and seeing if this is really representative of what you think social emotional learning should be focused on.
Yeah, I would agree. I think all of these things are definitely core competencies when dealing with social emotional issues.
Yeah.
Whenever I see graphs like this, though, or pictures, I think it should be more of like a nebulous, like these things are much more intertwined and a part of each other than being like separate little blocks. But yeah, I agree. I think all of those are very important.
That's a great point. Yeah, maybe some like wavy lines in between them. If these could be wavy and spill over a little bit more. Yeah, did you?
I thought responsible decision making was like kind of just stood out the most to me because I think it kind of goes across all spectrums. Like even like I think for a student, like when they're reading, for example, like reading is pretty much decision making. Like you're just grouping words and you're trying to figure out what they mean. So readers are good, responsible decision makers. And I think like in and out of the classroom, like whether to go to class, like you have a test next period, and you can ditch this class and go study for it. Is that a responsible decision? But I think that has a lot to do with emotional learning.
Cool, thank you. So it stood out like in a positive way. Is that okay? Cool.
Yeah, and I think with what Jamal was saying, self-awareness, social awareness, all of those are involved in responsible decision making. If you're not self-aware, you're probably not able to make responsible and good decisions.
If I can ask a question, can you guys hear me?
Yes, hi Amy.
Hi, I always come back to, I didn't know if this was going to work because I talk a lot, as you guys learned yesterday, but I think it's going to be okay. I always come back to the whole social norms and just ethical standard statements. I'm looking at the circle diagram on the website, and I just always kind of wonder about the question of what those norms are and who creates those norms. And I mean, I think that, I've been asked questions before, like, you know, if I say I do this because of the best interest of my students, and then someone might say, but what if I disagree with you on what's in the best interest of the students? And I always kind of come around to that, and I know it goes into maybe relationship skills and being able to respond that way, but I guess it's about the overall community of the school kind of, I don't know, having their own social norms. And I think I said yesterday, it's like posing the question, like, the community, I think, who's responsible for this population of children within a building, even within a classroom, sort of needs to kind of agree a little bit on those things. I don't know. I might be posing a question, or I don't know what's going on. So I can always think about that.
No, that's such a great point. Does anyone have any initial responses? Well, I do. Somebody else does. No, I think. I think an area that the field really needs to still grow in is in terms of both in the areas of self-awareness and social awareness is in terms of critical thought around issues of racism, sexism, etc. I do think that there's space in social emotional learning to do so. I think that I think it fits so well in the idea of coming to understand both who you are individually and who you are in relation to a larger society. And but I think that at this point, social and emotional learning seems to kind of come from the standpoint of like a more individualistic approach or an individualistic understanding of self. So I think that kind of some of the things you're speaking to there, Amy, about concerns of, who's deciding these social norms is something that at present isn't being taken up too much in the field. And I think that it's something that absolutely should be. So I'm really glad that you took us there. Actually, interestingly enough, the first piece that I have found really examining the role of culture in social emotional learning just came out in this handbook. So I think, if we want to, we could all write an article about it together and kind of move the field in that direction. I think it's something that needs to, that really needs to be part of its next steps. But I think that you brought up an amazing point, and that it's not, when they say, like on the website, social norms, there isn't a lot of questioning right now behind who is deciding those social norms. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? And you can feel free to disagree with me if you like. That's just kind of my read on where the field is, but feel free to disagree if.
Well, and I just. Oh, okay. I think you guys can hear me. Okay. It's echoing. So one of the things I put on our thread when we were talking, and maybe that's why we disappeared, was I was a co-teacher with 2 different kindergarten teachers this year, and I found both of their classrooms to be probably the most, for me, it was a very bipolar experience because I go from one environment to the next environment, and it was all about environment building within the classroom. Neither one of them wrong, just both very different communication styles. The kids reacted differently, and those kind of fall in the same kind of lines of those questions that I have within that realm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just our styles.
That's a great point too. I feel like in the sense that like we're all individuals as teachers, and our, however you want to you think of it, how yourself, your soul, your person, is going to influence kind of, or at least I think should be taken into consideration when you're thinking about kind of what programs work for you. I think, if what is comfortable for you is having kind of a bit of a more controlled space, maybe with more of like a lecture style approach, then maybe one of the scripted curriculums is what's going to fit well for you. Personally, I'm a big fan of the infused approach, but I wouldn't want to say that that's right for everyone, because perhaps that would make that I think sometimes if you try to approach things in a way that doesn't fit with your personal style of delivery and approach, that sometimes it can make you grow, but I think sometimes it doesn't really come together, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know. I'm talking too much today. So.
I can't see if people are raising their hands. I'm trying to be respectful, but I was part of this study this year through DU on the inner core of a teacher, and I thought it was very, very interesting the way that they kind of measured it, because the study is a PhD study based on, we can teach how to write objectives, we can teach how to do lesson plans, we can teach, all the basic structures of learning, but one of the things that they were studying is they're actually someone who considers working with young people, up into college even, yourself as well, as a calling, and what it is about the demeanor of that person that kind of makes them more effective and yada, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of in the beginning stages, but it's really interesting because they do talk about just different subtleties that happen within a classroom. They want to move into kind of be taught, writing objectives can be taught. So just food for thought, that's all.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, sorry.
What was their measure? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I was just a participant, but I can tell you, I'd have to go back and look at my notes. That's the only I remember thing. But they came in and they did observations, and they found that just one of the things that came up was terms of endearment. I know that sounds really weird, but referring to people, especially young children, I guess. With the term of endearment was one of them. There's 5 different competencies. I can just type them in there or something if you guys are curious, but I would have to go back and look at my notes. I just answered questions and let them come in. That was it.
Sounds really cool.
Environment of your classroom. They said that walking in someone's classroom and you can actually see that it's their room was one significant quantifier. Just by personality, I guess. I'm sure we've all seen that. I don't know. I'll post some things up there, but I'll just type it in or something.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. That's really interesting. And I think that's something to keep in mind, too, as we look at, if you're thinking of kind of for your programmatic investigation, for lack of a better word, looking at one focused on teachers, is you'll probably get into some of the literature looking, as you just said, Amy, framing teaching as either a calling or as a vocation, as opposed to either a job or a profession, in which point, which kind of gets you into this idea of the personal investment in it. If it's not just either a job or a profession, and there's a piece of you or how you define yourself, a piece of your identity invested in your role as a teacher, kind of how that impacts both what you do in the classroom, impacts your relationship with students, and certainly a consideration for when we're thinking about social emotional learning programs focused around teachers and teacher well-being. I'm talking way too much today. So other thoughts or ideas that came up for you?
I think it comes back to this seems very I was saying this to my group, common sense.
Yeah.
You teach these in your classroom and you infuse it in all of your lesson.
Yeah. And
even things I just wrote down quickly in my notes. We do this through our personal financial literacy unit.
Okay.
And it all talks about responsible decision making based on problems and what your costs would be. And so you have to kind of be socially aware of what's going on and what's going to be best for you in the long run. So I don't know, you kind of hit, and it goes all over the place, but you hit all of these things in everything that you do. And it goes back to it's kind of ingrained in us as teachers to do it. And I know that it hit that in the scientific base linking social and emotional learning to school success. And it talked about how if you think back to teachers that really kind of were close to you as a child, it was all about the teachers who were the ones that helped build your character, and not the ones that had, really great lesson plans on long division.
No, that's fabulous. Yeah.
I think
this is sort of related for our teacher evaluations in TPS. 10% of our evaluation is student surveys, like what students think of the teachers, which there's a lot of different opinions on that, like people with undeveloped brains are evaluating us, but also it's really helpful. Like I like to see the results because it's really helpful to see what kids think of you, because it's also broken down by like grade level, boys, girls, all these different demographic factors. And one of they have to like agree or disagree or be neutral with all these different statements. And one of them is, I feel that my teacher cares about me, which I don't know. It's interesting to see how they respond to that, because I think students and teachers also have very different definitions of care. Like, why haven't you been here? Where's your work? That's me caring. Yeah. Where like a kid might think like, oh, cookies every day is me caring about them. So, but I think it's interesting that it's part of it. Kind of a neat idea.
Yeah. And to segue with that, because I do those, that was my goal last year, was to be more self-reflective, and so I started doing student evaluations at the end of each semester, and I was shocked at how nice they were. It was shocking to me, really, because I'm who I am. I think as a teacher, like, my issue with these prescriptive programs is that kids, more than anything, value authenticity. And the one thing that they will all say about me is I am totally real, whatever that means. And there are days, when maybe I'm a little too real, but again, we have that relationship. There are days when I'm pretty, I don't give false praise. I can be very, very critical of children. But again, I think that it's the authenticity of like, that's who I am. They know that. And I think if you come from an authentic place, they know you care. And I think teacher evaluations are very good. I don't, know if they should be used for evaluation or not, but I know for me, it's a small little, and I wouldn't have any problem with that because they are the customers, even though the parents often think they are. It's the kids that we serve. And I found those to be very helpful. One kid wrote one semester in sociology teaches how to think, not what to think. And, and I was like, oh, I knew who it was, if they were anonymous or not, it was their choice. And I knew who had written it, and I knew what the statement was, framed around. But I'm like, that is so great to chew on and to be, again, reflective as an instructor. I think, again, the power of this is each teacher looking at how I'm developing my children in all these areas. And I think if we all start there, it can be very powerful, even without a program.
Yeah. Does anyone else have experience with student perceptions? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of coattail off what she was saying.
Yeah, please.
I think that's a good place to start with our children, but I also think that that's a great place to start from within ourselves as well. Like the most students that the more students that you actually, like, when you share a little bit of yourself, students, it's been to my experience that students are more receptive to what you're learning because they believe in what you're actually saying. I can look you in your eye and you believe that I'm telling you something from a good place. It's not any kind of ulterior motives or any other agendas. You can hear me and you don't have to worry about, filtering through any kind of, messaging or anything. So I think, we kind of spoke on it a little bit yesterday, but I think modeling is also like it's a great place to start, man. Yeah, we want to teach our kids great curriculum. We want to teach them long division, multiplication, everything, but ultimately it's come down to relationships, and how much do I trust you? How can I listen to you? Do I respect you? Is what you're telling me, is it going in one ear and out the other? Am I actually getting the message, chewing on it, internalizing it, and creating that space to where I can come back to my teacher and ask them, hey, I'm having an issue with that, and it's perfectly fine. I'm not going to feel like they're condemning me or that they're looking down on me or anything like that. So I think, mostly, and this is kind of the problem I've really been having, like, with this education program, man. Because, we're teaching curriculum, but, ultimately, it's relationships that we're really dealing with. You know what I mean? I'm not the smartest guy. I can tell you a lot of stuff I learned in college, honestly, but I could tell you the people that really impacted me and the people that made me want to do better and that made me, and that lit a fire in me, that was, I really didn't understand the lesson plan today, but they spoke to me in a way, and it took me. I took something away from the classroom that I can go home, and it was very thought provoking. They plant seeds, just one by one, and they just watch them and let them grow. So I think it's more so relational. And I think this is a good place to start, but I think first of all we got to start from kind of within ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Sue.
Our program. things I want to say, so I have to kind of think
what order to go in.
What order. Our program teaches curriculum, but all of our teachers, we're in 29 Denver public schools, not in South, but all the other directions, East, West, North, Lincoln, and the middle schools that feed into them and the elementary schools. But all of our teachers are teacher mentors, and so they teach the curriculum within the context of the class. But they're meeting with kids at Starbucks. We have an adventure program where they go whitewater rafting and snowboarding. We have so there's the after school, there's the in-school, post-secondary, where we're following them into college, and then adventure. And so we've been around 30 years, so we can see kids from the time they were in 4th grade and follow them through. And that's one reason why our program has been so successful, not only in Denver, but we've gone to 5 cities around the country. And one of the things that we really bring into the classroom is just exactly what you said. It's part of the teacher training. When you take one of these competencies like decision making, one of the main things that the teachers are trained to do is tell us about a decision in your own life.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about some of the goals you had when you were in middle school and high school, and they are open books for their students, and they're creating that climate of trust, and then obviously following up after school because they're going out, spending time, getting to know the family. And so it's a really comprehensive approach and has been really successful, and I think that that relational piece, that's our mission, to build long-term life-changing relationships with urban youth. And I think that that piece of being that one caring adult in the life of a student long-term is really successful. And I've had an opportunity to see that as students have gone through our program over the last 22 years now that I've been with the program. So
that's awesome.
So what is the program? I'm sorry.
It's called Colorado Uplift, and then
oh yeah, no, I know Colorado Uplift.
Oh,
it was in one of my elementary schools in Denver that I taught in.
Okay, which one was
it? I was at Columbine Elementary.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So nice in Columbine.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
awesome.
That program now it's called different things around the country. It's Elevate New York, Orlando, Portland, Phoenix, because Colorado Uplift is only the Denver name, but that's what it is around the country. And
cool.
So, yeah.
Very cool. As we've been talking, it reminded me kind of one of my, that a totally untested theory in my head is that when we talk about social emotional learning as being common sense, I think that jives for people who see teaching as a vocation or a calling. But I also think that kind of in the reform space we're in right now, where there's a push towards more standardization of the curriculum and more scripted approaches and didactic instruction, that having having a research base under SEL saying this is helpful, this is necessary, this is beneficial to students in so many ways, is necessary, unfortunately, because the vision of teaching that's kind of put out with this scripted and standardized approach doesn't emphasize as much the relationships. So I think having this field there saying that this is important and you need to focus on this is good, just in the sense that it places the emphasis back on the relational aspects of teaching and learning. I think in a space where it kind of feels like that's being less emphasized or pushed out. But that, I don't know, that's just for me. It feels like one of the reasons that even though it feels so common sense, it's like, why is there all this research on it? Of course it benefits student outcomes, but in some sense I think we need that in terms of the context we're in right now, to be able to say this is beneficial and this is why we need to put so much focus on relationships and as you mentioned, kind of helping teachers to understand themselves so that they can best interact with students. And
I think with this Common Core movement that we've had to emphasize assessments for a long time. All of our energy has gone there, and I finally see our team getting to the point where, okay, we have it laid out now. We have the assessments laid out. Now let's talk about what we've been dying to talk about for the last 10 years, pedagogy. And that's where, again, when you look at how you transfer the knowledge, you can look at these components and start, what's the best collaborative learning tools, which are, I think the teachers want tools to do these things in their own classrooms. And that can be done, again, collectively in Common Cores and throughout the school. But I think that when you take these things into account, then your best practices follow. And I think that's the next leg of this movement. Now the assessments have been finally written, or at least at this point, until the district or whoever comes in and says, oh, we were just kidding. Here's the new set. But hoping that building-wise that's where we're at least in my building.
So what about social emotional learning outside of school context? Because I know we have a lot of us here are kind of classroom teachers, but we have a number of people also working in other areas that are still relational areas. So kind of thinking like maybe a little bit on a broader scale. Like what's the role of social emotional learning and social emotional competencies in other relationship areas? Coaching, doctors, or even outside kind of the core content areas, if you have students that you're not seeing very often. How do we, do we think these kind of core competencies still fit when we're looking at it in a broader context, or do you think this is like potentially, or primarily a school-based focus? Yeah.
I think it can definitely go outside the school, especially like in the workforce area as well. Just because like you have to have you have to have all of those competencies to like work anywhere. Like me personally working for Disney, like you have to have major relationship skills, like to work with like the cast and working with like, the guests that come in, and then you have to have like responsible decision making, if something ever happens, what decisions are going to be making. Like social awareness, like you never know like what customers, we call bad guests.
It's a nice way to put it.
This is a very bad word for the store.
Okay.
Like you never know, like if there's customers coming into the store, like we want to be always prepared and social aware, and then like self-management, being sure like what we're gonna be doing, what we have going on, do this like X, Y, and Z. So I think it definitely goes outside the classroom, from workforce to sports to anything really.
Yeah, thanks. Please, yes.
Well, I mean, I teach catering, and that class in it of itself, I mean, it lends itself to workplace to me, because, I mean, again, we employ all, part of my rubric even is professionalism.
Okay.
I mean, the students don't get, sometimes they get to pick who they work with, sometimes they don't, but they have to work well in a group. You're working with hot oil or water or sharp objects. Like, you need to know how to be responsible and also work as a team. We have competitions. They need to collaborate. I mean, it's all these skills you use in whatever job it is that you decide. I mean, most of my students probably won't go into cooking professionally, but even wherever they work, I mean, I don't know I know that in the core classes in high school, I mean, you work in groups somewhat, but a lot of it's individual. And in my class, I mean, every day you're in a group. So, yeah, you need to have these skills.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Well, I would only hope that the type of citizens and communities we try to build in our schools would model the same thing that we want outside of our schools. So.
I wonder, I'm kind of thinking a little bit about like the approach to it, I guess, in different areas. Like how, so either in the workforce or in different contexts, like coaching, or as a doctor, I'm thinking of therapy and mental health. How do we prepare people for those roles and having social emotional competencies as adults. Like if they didn't go through all kinds of social emotional learning in school contexts, I don't know, what are your thoughts on what that, yeah, please.
I want to pose another question. I don't know, can that be taught?
It is a great question. What do you guys think?
I think at a certain level, like, I don't know, I think at a certain level, sometimes, like, people have discernment and sometimes people don't. I think that's more so about identifying the people that we put in power. And, I mean, the teachers, head coaches, whatever the case may be, general managers, whatever, the CEOs. Like, I mean, without getting too far in the workplace and, media and all this, whatever. But I just think it's more so like we have to, I don't know if it can be taught or not.
I see a couple hands, so this is wonderful. I'm glad you hit on a good topic. Yeah.
I'm gonna add on to that, like, it might also be more of like an observable kind of content, like you can like observe like your parents like when you're young, and like that's like the relationship skills that like you can learn from, or like playing on the field or playing on the court, you observe like all these different relationship skills, and you observe like the social awareness of what other people are doing, and I think that's how like we learn, is like through other people, through like observation, not necessarily like lecture hall 101.
Right.
I don't know. I think there's absolutely different levels of competency in these 5 areas: self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, whatever. But I think they definitely are taught in consulting. We had people come in for business development training where, you try and sell your business. So like as a consultant, you're selling basically your own skills and the skills of your peers. And, the social awareness and relationship skills that you need to develop effective relationships so you can sell, what your skill set are hugely important. And, just being aware of these ideas and being aware of different social situations and how people might respond differently, or, how you can come across and present ideas to be more effectively received by your target audience. Like, that's definitely something I feel like that can be taught, or at least that tries to be taught.
So I just kind of, can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I know
Yes.
you're saying that, sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
I might get a verbal no, I'm just kidding. So I think that in terms of social emotional learning, I've always kind of looked at it like a toolbox. So we can't expect everyone to believe that responding to each other the same way is like the whole norm question. But I do think that providing young children and young adults and people within a workplace with a toolbox to kind of dig into is really the only thing that we can kind of expect. I think the problem comes down to, we all think it's a value to have it within, our young children through coaching, or through, like you said, doctors, or, anybody neighbors who come in contact with young children. We would hope that they would all be part of that, but there's that whole question of who's a role model and why am I a role model and all those kinds of things. But I do think that giving children a toolbox, or people a toolbox, is probably the only thing that we can expect. But people don't emphasize it in teacher education. It's not part of any of the things that they value within policy. I know there's a couple of legislations out there, but that's all. That's what I think, more or less.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, Nate.
Yeah, the toolbox idea, I really like that. So I wanted to share an experience that I had. One of the best SEL experiences. Now, being in this class, I realized how much it was social emotional learning. But have you guys ever heard of NOLS? So I got an opportunity to go on it's like a half NOLS trip. So it's National Outdoor Leadership School. So essentially NOLS, it's like there's different types of trips you can take. So it's a backpacking trip. You go for 30 days. You can go 60 days. Some you can even go 90. But I got to go on a 15-day trip, and it was with my last job, and it was everybody on our executive team. We went for 15 days in the wilderness, and what was interesting about it is we all felt like we were pretty good socially and emotionally. And then getting in that context, it really all of these things, I mean, it gave us more tools. So what we had to do was, so only so much you could carry, right? And when you're going to hike for days on end, you have to pack light.
Yeah.
So every night each of us had sets of ingredients that we had to carry. So every night we had to get together and make dinner together. But there was no recipe. We just had random ingredients that were given to us. So we had to collaborate with each other and figure out how to do it. And there were lots of fights. Lots of fights. I mean, grown adult people screaming at each other. And it was intense. But 15 days of that. And not only that, you're exhausted. Your feet hurt. Everything hurts. And you have to deal with all these issues. And it's like, it is intense SEL training.
Yeah.
But what I gained from that was a toolbox, and it's transferred to so many things in my life that I can pull back from that experience and use, and even in this class and learning. I mean, the examples are endless, but I just wanted to share that experience.
Thank you so much. Yeah, yeah.
A friend of mine works for them. She's an instructor, and she's in Alaska for 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Right now, but she and I talked a lot about programs like Knowles, where you have to pay thousands of dollars to go on these trips, and like, I don't know, some of my students, they don't understand why people would want to go camping. Like, why would you want to pay money to sleep outside when you could just stay at home in a building? So I think that brings up a lot of the maybe class issues that SEL could. I'm looking for the right word.
Could address.
How are class and SEL related?
Yeah, I kind of wish everybody could go on a trip like that. Like even people that I work with now in a new job. I wish we could make everybody do it because of how intense it is and because of how you really get to figure out a lot of this really quickly.
How do you spell it?
NOLS. Knowles. And also what was interesting about our trip was I was on a trip there was 12 people on our trip, and 7 of those people had never camped before. So they didn't know how to do anything.
Everyone's face around the room was like, ooh.
You're right. I mean, if you know what that's like. I mean, our first mile and a half in, it was a disaster. But anyway.
Yeah.
Going back to whether or not it can be taught,
yeah.
I think about students that are on the spectrum, and we have a class at our school called social skills, and they're shown pictures of different people's expressions and asked, what emotion is this? And often they get it wrong because they just think completely different. So they do a lot of role play, and I can see them trying to transfer those skills over in my personal classroom. It's really interesting. So it's another tool. I also wish, as a pre-service teacher, that I would have had a class like this or more training in classroom management, because I feel like we lose a lot of teachers early on because they get thrown into a classroom and they don't really understand how management. If you don't have control of your classroom, there's going to be no learning. Yeah. And I look at my first year of teaching and I think about how students would burst out in anger, and I didn't know how to handle it.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe I was doing something wrong. Whereas now I feel like I'm more able to think, what's the root of why they're acting this way? And I can actually have a conversation with them instead of view it as a battle. So I just wish we had more training before, instead of having to figure out most things on our own and from other teachers around us.
Yeah, thanks so much for pointing that out. We're going to read an article next week about what it could look like in pre-service teacher education, because it's not... I mean, it's just starting to emerge, and there are some small pockets, but it's by no means widespread or universal.
I think it kind of relates a lot with the core content areas. A lot of feedback. The core content areas, and how we were talking about with multiple intelligence and taking the multiple intelligence tests through, like you were talking about, and finding out what areas that you don't excel as well in, and I think that you excel maybe sometimes in some situations, and then we need to, work in some pieces. Yeah. So I think we can also think about it that way. Patrick is you have the pieces. It's just a matter of kind of working them together. And again, like you were saying, knowing yourself and working on it within yourself too.
Yeah. That makes a lot of, yeah, because it's like, I mean, we think of it like any other intelligence or activities that I think we all have, like, our natural proclivities. There are some things that we're, don't know why, just take up more naturally than others. And there are some things that we have to really work at. But I think, for me, I do think that social emotional competencies can be taught, but that certainly some of us are naturally more predisposed to kind of be in tune with either our own feelings or with others' feelings, but that it's, you know, yeah.
I'd say not only can they be taught, but I feel like they've rapidly been forgotten. I feel like a lot of special social networking and technology is making people forget how to interact with one another. I find that really, really ironic that it's social networking, but you have people who, I mean, who's been to a dinner where someone's got their smartphone in front of their face and you're like, hi, like I'm right here, like shouldn't we be having an interaction? Can that person who's on the phone wait? There's things like that. There's things like people not picking up a phone and having a conversation with someone, but leaving a note on Facebook or whatever their social networking is. I feel like a lot of those things are what used to be considered social interactions, interpersonal interactions, are changing with the newer generation. And I feel like it needs to be explicitly, even more explicitly taught. Like if you have a problem with someone, it might be best to sit down face to face and talk it out.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think there's a lot that social media can't capture in the way of our facial expressions and gestures and stuff that face-to-face communication can. Yeah.
The theme I keep hearing is that we expose them to as many different situations as possible. Kind of going back to what we're, bring some simulations back. I think that's one way to do it. I had the opportunity to take some kids to Japan one year through the Freeman Foundation. It's here at CU, actually teaching for Center of East Asia. And there are 18 of us. You don't know people until you travel with them. I didn't even know myself until that trip. I saw every facet of myself. And so, I mean, when I look at this is all of our relationships. We learn these from our family. I saw an interaction just in the parking lot yesterday, and the tone. These two they were teenagers talking to the mom, but the tone, the interaction, the tone was so, it was interesting because it wasn't what they were saying, it was how they were saying it to each other.
Yeah.
And it's all of that. And I look at love, even just a basic relationship between two people. And I'm 40, I'll be 44 soon, and self-management's the one that I'm really focused on right now in my relationships. Like, it's not what I say, it's not saying something. And I think it takes a lifetime to learn these things, but again, the more that we just focus on that, teaching that to the kids, that this is a process and this is going to take a lifetime, and you have to be in different situations to know thyself. Mm-hmm. A classroom is so controlled sometimes, so structured that what do we really know? What do they really learn? We have to put them in different situations, sometimes uncomfortable, to learn those lessons. I just don't think everything should be positive and frilly. I think, again, even a negative experience can be really, really life-changing for a student in a positive way if it's framed.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So I was just looking and adjusting a little bit because this was an amazing conversation and I didn't want to stop it. But it seems like this may be a good point to stop and take a break if I'm reading the room correctly. So it's 2:40. If we could come back at 2:55, and then we'll pick up from there. All right, fabulous. Looks like most of us are back. So I just reworked things a little bit. So what I was hoping to do is first kind of just discuss and together come up with a little bit of a list of why we need social emotional learning. I know it was touched on a bit, at least in this text last night. And also just kind of drawing from our own experience and constructing an argument. Because as we know, kind of I feel like the first step in any education reform movement, or a lot of things in life, is to kind of establish a need before you can sell your product. So I feel like if in some way we can establish the absence of, or how other authors have constructed the absence of attention to this, we can create the foundation for the argument for social emotional learning. And I thought that might be helpful, at least just to situate ourselves before we get into taking a look at the very large meta-analysis that was done, which describes some of the benefits and outcomes of social emotional learning. So yeah, I thought just kind of opening it up in general, thoughts about why we need social emotional learning. And actually, let me pull out of this so I can edit it and write as we go. Hold on. Might be her daughter or something. Yeah, so thoughts? Yeah, thanks, Sue.
I think a lot of the skills aren't natural. For example, managing your emotions. For a lot of us, reacting in a way that's maybe not the most becoming is more natural than managing your emotions. In the area of self-awareness, I know one of the parts that Castle gets into is knowing your strengths and limitations. And I think that people are pretty aware of their weaknesses and limitations, but being able to know your strengths and articulate them is not something that you generally, it's almost like job interviewing skills. Most people don't automatically know how to sit in an interview and have eye contact and appropriate handshake, and these are skills that can be taught and are pretty needed. So.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
I think, too, we live in a much more complex and connected world every day. And I think people need the skills to know how to deal with and interact with and accept other people, of other cultures, and of other ways of being, and knowing how to deal with that themselves and be a part of that community.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, as we're in a increasingly multicultural and multilingual society, adapting to and knowing those skills for both understanding yourself and those around you. Other thoughts?
Kind of just as you said before, emotional intelligence is standalone, whereas multiple intelligence is, you need emotional intelligence for that. You need to have a drive. You need to be able to kind of support that in a different way. So it's the foundation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, emotional intelligence is the foundation for other forms of intelligence. Okay. Cool.
One of the writers that talks about the skills needed to live in a democracy. And at this point, we have 310 million people trying to get along. And often we have a political system that comes to a standstill, which was not always the case in this country. Even 30 years ago, there was an ability to, compromise. And I feel like as our country gets bigger and bigger, we have, there's been some discussion about what does a democracy look like when we have 1 billion people. The only other country that's done that is India. So, it's going to take a lot of discussion, and this generation coming up, they're going to be the ones living in a country that's that big, and we all really need to get along together.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gabe. Any other thoughts? Well, we can return to this. This is really what was echoed. I was just taking a look, and this isn't a chapter that we're reading in here, but they kind of spend some time in this textbook kind of highlighting the rationale for social emotional learning, and in slightly different language, they basically were talking about the same thing. So way to go, guys. So we can certainly come back to this, but I was thinking next I'd like to move us into the meta-analysis that we took a look at. I wanted to take a minute to situate it a little bit, both in terms of what came before it, in terms of these large-scale analyses, and also just in terms of when we're looking at social-emotional learning programs, the ways they can differ with regard to focus and scope. But before I do that, I just wanted to kind of get your general thoughts about how did this reading go? I know it was highly technical, so were you able to find some key ideas? We're going to dig into it together a little bit and kind of like try to pull out some of the key ideas, but as an initial first go at that, how was it? Kind of like thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle?
My psychology statistics class.
Okay. That's fair. That's totally fair. Okay, well, let me just kind of do, I'll put this actually on the slide. So I kind of wanted to situate the study in two ways. First of all, looking at the only other study that came before that in terms of one of these really large-scale reviews, and then I'll move into, which I think will be helpful for us, in particular as we move forward looking at programs, the different ways different ways that they're taken up. So, but starting first, so this DURLAC meta-analysis is the one that's most highly cited for sure, and it's the largest. There was one 3 years prior that was called, and I can absolutely put this on D2L if it's of interest to you at all. It was called The Positive Impact of, actually I think I put a, there, this is a picture from the cover of the report. All right. It was called The Positive Impact of Social and Emotional Learning for Kindergarten through to 8th grade students, findings from 3 scientific reviews. This one was different than the DURLAC one in that it basically this report was broken into 3 parts. So in the DURLAC report, we're looking, and as they went through and explained, and we'll take a look at a little bit more in a little bit here, but they were really looking primarily at one type of program, like the in-school type of program that was looked at for the universal population of students. This one kind of took on 3 populations. So they evaluated, it was 300, they took 317 studies, and they looked at them first. The first one was the universal review, which was looked at, just like the DURLAC one, it examined the impact of universal school-based programs designed for the general student population. So that was most similar to the DURLAC piece. The second one they looked at, which they called the indicated review, and this looked at school-based intervention programs that identified and worked with students who were either displaying early signs of social, emotional, or behavior problems or had otherwise been diagnosed with that. So these were kind of like specific student populations. And the third review they did as part of this study, they called the after-school review, and these were for out-of-school time programs specifically. So this one kind of covered a little bit more in terms of the types of different programs it looked at, but didn't look at as many studies. And also, this was, and I think another reason why this wasn't taken as seriously in the literature is because it was put together by CASEL. So this wasn't like, there was a bit of a conflict of interest there, in the sense that, you know, obviously CASEL wants to show that there are benefits to social emotional learning. So when when the 2011 review was done, it was outside of CASEL's influence. But you will see that the same, social emotional learning seems to be a fairly small field, and that the same names keep coming up. So you can see that DURLAC was a part of this study as well, but it was funded through CASEL, and whereas the next one was not affiliated with CASEL in terms of its research and funding. And like I said, I'd be happy to post this on D2L if it's of interest. This one is not anywhere near as widely cited, but it's still interested to take a look. Just to kind of tell you a little bit about what they found. So as a point of comparison, it was really similar to the DURLAC, what the DURLAC study found in terms of the results of their universal review. They found that students who participated in universal social emotional learning programs demonstrated significantly enhanced social emotional skills, attitudes, and positive social behavior, reduced behavior problems and emotional distress, and improved academic performance. And again, I'll post this for you I have my notes attached and stuff so you can go through. They did note that not all of the universal interventions were equally effective. So they did provide kind of the summary of this is what was happening overall for everyone, but they also kind of then broke down into, well, which programs in which classrooms were doing better. And what they found was that multi-component programs, although people liked them, they didn't show as significant outcomes, just like in the DURLAC study, which we'll go into. And the authors kind of thought this was because of the challenge of implementing multi-component programs, meaning that if you're trying to coordinate between what's happening in school during the after-school program and also in the home and community, there's just going to be more variables to take into account. So they did not recommend that we shouldn't do multi-component programs, just that the significance was less for those components than for just the school-based programs. They also talked about fidelity of implementation in the study as well. So for those teachers that were really kind of sticking to the program, both in terms of like how often it was supposed to be done, in terms of duration, frequency, and attending to all the elements of the program, that those students in those classrooms had higher gains than students in classrooms where teachers were not following the program as stipulated. Those were kind of big pieces in this. Yeah. Any specific questions about this? I mean, there's no reason, this was just kind of to provide a little bit of contextualization. This isn't something that you certainly need to know, but I'd be happy to post that on D2L if it's interesting to you and you want to go through. Another interesting thing about this one is that, you know, it's only kindergarten through 8th grade, so it does not touch on high school, and it does not touch on the early childhood either. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is how social emotional learning programs vary. And there's kind of 3 common ways. First is the scope and focus, so what are they looking at? And again, I'll post all this. So, but there's, the first is the scope and focus of the program. The second is what audience the program's intended to address. So it could be, you know, again, universal student program for kind of for everyone in the classroom. It could be an approach, a targeted approach for specific students. It could be in, you know, after school time. It could be for teachers. And the third way that it varies is kind of the method of infusion. So I'm going to go through each of these a little bit. So with regard to the scope and focus, we kind of just touched on that a bit within talking about the last study, but universal programs are generally tailored to promoting student strengths. So for those programs that are just for the general student population, they're looking at promoting the strengths that are there. Social emotional programs can also focus on students with special needs or who have been part of a targeted groups assessed and determined for needing some type of intervention or extra support. In those cases, usually you have both kind of working from the strengths still, but also kind of an eye on the specific behavioral or emotional supports needed. So they're a little bit more individualized in that regard. So you're not only kind of you're not only acknowledging the strengths and building from there, but also noting where you need additional support structures. And the other kind of the third focus is for educators and teachers. So the idea that social emotional education, and again, as we've discussed, we haven't gone too far with this yet in the field, but that social emotional education, surprise, surprise, can also serve educators and school specialists in ways to help strengthen both their social emotional competencies and their instructional approach. Questions or thoughts about that? Okay, so those are the three main kind of audiences, so to speak. In terms of the pedagogical approach or the way that it's infused, going back to Jonathan Cohen, because this was always super, I found the way he framed it really helpful. He advocates looking at this as like a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have programs that are pretty much fully scripted, like they're directed, they're detailed, they're standalone programs. And on the fully other side of the program, you have programs that kind of provide, which we've been talking about a little bit, related to like classroom culture, kind of provide more ways of thinking about how to be and how to interact in the classroom, both for teacher and student relationships and student to student relationships. So that has less of a formal structure, or really sometimes not a formal structure at all. It's more, a way of being and interacting in the classroom that is taught. Somewhere in the middle, you have programs that maybe take up a little bit of both of this. So maybe they have a really specific idea about like how children develop, or a specific view of how learning should be approached. And they're not fully scripted, but they're not kind of fully, just kind of in the middle. They're the free floaters that maybe have a little bit of an approach. I tend to think of the responsive classroom a little bit this way in the middle, in the sense that it does have some structures that you use. They encourage having like the morning meeting during the day, but they also, it's not scripted, and that it also encourages you to use those means of communication that you've set up throughout the day and in the rest of your instruction as well. In terms of, sorry, I went a little backwards. In terms of scope and focus, pretty much at this point, almost all the programs use those 5 core competencies as their focus. Some of them will take on, like I was saying earlier, with the random acts of kindness, for example, will take on an additional or have like a key area that they're really focused on. But for the most part, that those 5 core competencies are considered universal across the programs. So yeah, I'll post these and the notes on them, but just something to keep in mind as we start looking at specific programs and stuff next week, as we start thinking about kind of which programs we're interested in, what we want to research, is these are kind of the main 3 ways that they differ from each other in terms of what they're focused on, in terms of who they're intended to address, and then in terms of how they're infused into the curriculum in the school day. Yeah, okay. So I was hoping to start off with Durlac by taking, let's see, what is that, taking about 15 minutes, again, with each other or individually, whatever you'd like, and kind of looking at the article with these ideas in mind. These are some of the key things that I'm hoping we can draw out together, is like, what were they looking at here? Who were the participants? What outcome measures did they use to assess? What did they predict would happen, and then kind of what happened differently? What went away from their predictions? And then if you have time, looking at either discussion or their directions for future research. And then don't worry if you can't find this stuff, we're going to kind of, my idea being that we can try to look for it either in small groups or with partners, or individually if that's more comfortable, and then come back together and kind of put this together and come up with our kind of main takeaways from this piece. So it's 3:15. Let's take till 3:30 and kind of break, and if you want to get back in your same groups from before, that's great. If you want to meet some new friends, or if you just feel like working alone, and I'll circulate around if you're having trouble finding stuff and jump in with you. And then at 3:30, we'll come back together and kind of make sense of these ideas. Cool. Let's just go through each of these kind of areas and work together. So participants, who is in this? Don't all shout out at once.
270,000 K through 12 students.
Awesome. Yeah, and how did they how did they pick those K through 12 students? What was this based on? Kind of what were their parameters for being included in the meta-analysis?
Certain criteria.
Yeah.
I guess they excluded programs that targeted only a specific group of students. So the programs they included were ones that were targeted at a whole school rather than only the kids with issues or something.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, they looked at just the programs that were targeted towards a specific, that were targeted towards the whole student population. So I think it was a total then of, was 317, was it programs or studies? Or I'm sorry.
Studies.
Studies, 317. Okay, so it took the results of the 317 studies. Or 213, sorry. I was going from the other one. 213 for this one. It was 317 for the other one.
Is it programs?
It's programs.
The programs. Yeah, K through 12 SEL programs. So this report differed slightly from the one we were just talking about earlier in that it looked only at the universal programs, and the other one had kind of 3 different target areas. So what about outcome measures? And this is a thing we're going to be it'll come up again next week as well when we're looking at how are we assessing SEL programs. What for them was a success? How did they characterize the successful programs?
Social emotional skills.
Yeah, thanks.
Decline in referrals, things like that, quantitative things.
Aren't you looking for the dependent variables? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, the measures they were looking at. So we had the social emotional skills, the conduct problems, they listed.
Said there were 6 student outcomes.
Yeah.
So there was social emotional skills, attitudes towards self and others, positive social behaviors, conduct problems, emotional distress, and academic performance.
Yeah, awesome. So what do you make of that in terms of, what do you make of those, I guess, as outcome measures of SEL programs? So you're looking at the student level, what their social emotional skills were, looking at the conduct problems and emotional distress, so you also have kind of framing from the negative side, as well as academic performance. Are those, I guess this is for you personally, if you're looking for, looking at programs, what are you looking for in the programs? Are you looking for something that's going to positively impact academic achievement? Are you more interested in the social emotional skills that are going to come out of it? Just curious.
And don't they all affect academic achievement? Whether or not they can be aware of other people and how they can collaborate with others.
Right. For sure. Just in terms of how they're actually, when we start digging into individual programs and looking at what kind of the research is around those individual programs, I was just curious what would be compelling to you to hear that it was successful in terms of raising student test scores, or to hear that there were less,
I think in regards to purpose, I think, social emotional skills, attitudes towards self and others, positive social behavior, conduct problems, emotional stress, I think those in regards to purpose for me personally, my purpose is not necessarily for students to get good grades, but my purpose is for them to become great human beings. Okay. So I think that's more purposeful to me than just academic performance.
Great, yeah, thanks, yeah.
I completely agree with that. Make them the best that they can be. Thinking from an administrator's perspective, I don't think that there are enough outcomes showing academic performance and what specific areas that would make it consistent. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not dealing with the kids personally.
Absolutely. So the authors made several predictions about what they thought would happen, and in their their predictions didn't all come true. So what was like, what in this were they surprised by, or what were you surprised by? Were there things both either for them in terms of their predictions that didn't come to fruition, or for you as you went through and kind of were thinking about what was going to happen or what the end result would be that surprised you in what they found? Yeah.
So on page 418 on the right, they said contrary to our hypothesis, we did not find the expected additional benefit of multi-component programs over single component, for example, classroom-only programs, a finding that has been reported in other reviews of prevention and youth development intervention.
Yeah. Yes. What about, did that surprise you? I mean, for me it did the first time I read this and the other report. I was like, wait, but wouldn't multi-component and kind of, which I touched on a little bit in talking about the 2008 piece, is that, I mean, I think my initial reaction was surprise, but it makes sense when you kind of think about all the additional variables you have to take into account when you're looking at a program that is going across contexts. But I think in general that finding for this article, a lot of people were surprised by, but also there was concern that finding would lead to people not trying to implement multi-component programs, thinking that, you know, we wouldn't get as good results. So I think that there's definitely a push to kind of say, you know, even though it doesn't show up in the effect sizes as clearly, that there are still benefits to this, more on the qualitative side, that you can kind of speak with students about experiences and stuff. Any other kind of surprises or things, I guess just generally speaking, that stuck out to you? So it's like, oh, either that surprised you or kind of confirmed things you'd already been thinking? Yeah.
Mess up the implementation, it's over. So, I mean, if it's not implemented correctly from the beginning, then it's not going to have any long lasting.
Great point. Yeah. The one piece that made me excited is when you see that it matters who's doing it. When they talked about that it was more effective when coming from school personnel than non-school personnel, which I think kind of goes back to our just general discussion about the importance of relationships in teaching and learning. When you have someone that you don't know coming into the space and teaching a social emotional learning program, it doesn't work as well as with its an established, trusted adult. So other things about this that you want to touch on? Okay, I wanted us to read this. We will not be digging into a lot of, other than when we start looking into individual programs, in which case you may be looking at some studies like this, but on a much smaller scale in terms of looking at the specific program, and I would say a randomized control of that program. But I wanted us to take a look at this because this is so widely referenced in the literature base, and other than the one that preceded it that was funded through CASEL, it's really the only large-scale meta-analysis of social emotional learning outcomes and benefits. So I think there are definitely some pieces of this that we may disagree with in terms of methodology, but it's worth having some familiarity with because it's just going to keep being referenced as we move forward when we're talking about outcomes and benefits. So let's, I'd like for us to move into kind of thinking about how we want to define social emotional learning, but I want to take a second and kind of stick with this idea of what the benefits of or outcomes of social emotional learning programs are. And I was curious kind of how you thought the findings of this piece in terms of what the outcomes were lined up with either of the other two pieces we've read for today in terms of benefits and outcomes, or didn't align. as well as just kind of with your own experience or other programs that you have experience with. So basically, just I'm kind of hoping to open up a broader discussion about outcomes and benefits of social emotional learning. Why are we doing it?
Well, something that we talked about in the digital group is that there was a discussion about a lot of the studies did not follow the kids too far into the future. There was, maybe 1 year out was about as far out as it went. And so I think all of us on a very basic level know that these are skills that we want those kids to have throughout their lives, but the research doesn't really follow and show. So let's say a kid goes to a school and has a CEL program from K to 5, what effect is that going to have on them later? And something that we were talking about and I was thinking about is that, let's say the CEL program is an elementary based, and then they go off to middle school and high school, and let's say the researchers are able to follow a significant group of those kids and talk to them again in high school. There's so many things that happen in between. Maybe they all had a really amazing teacher in 8th grade. It becomes very, very difficult to trace back, was it the exposure to CEL that made the difference, or, there's so many other variables then, but it is interesting to see what happened in between. Does it really have an effect on them as young adults or adults?
That's a great point. I think, unfortunately, and I wish we had those, it is so expensive to do those kind of long, those longitudinal studies and follow students for a long period of time, particularly with and attrition rates and losing people along the way. But I think that would be amazing, because I think you're absolutely right that we're looking at things that are really long-term goals, and to kind of actually see their impact is hard to do after a year. Other thoughts about outcomes, benefits, things that you think should be emphasized in terms of why we're arguing for social emotional learning?
Another quote from the Durlac study from page 420 said that the new Institute of Medicine report indicated that the promotion of competence, self-esteem, mastery, and the social inclusion can serve as a foundation for both prevention and treatment of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of speaks to the degree that, our social interaction just in our society today, that I think we have a lot fewer opportunities to develop a community than we did, years prior, where extended families maybe lived closer together, and we knew our neighbors a little more, and we just interacted with more people besides, as from a student's perspective, your parents and teachers on a daily basis. And I think that, SEL is really important to help us develop effective tools to communicate and interact with each other, because of how important that communication is in our lives.
Mm. Thanks, Molly. Yeah.
Something that's been in the news a lot, or at least in my bubble of education news, is the word grit, and there's been a lot of criticism of that.
Yep.
As it's important to teach kids to be resilient. I think we could probably all agree that that's true, but teaching, and I hate the word grit, I don't know, but using that as a substitute for meeting kids' basic needs is not okay. So I was wondering if we're going to be addressing that at all? Or?
So grit is more associated with character education movement than with the social emotional learning movement. And I think in general, that the character education movement, if you look kind of at where these different programs are falling, and it's starting to shift a bit, but in general, the character education movements slightly, actually I think they even talked about a little bit in here, we're slightly more kind of didactic instruction, and also showing up more in communities that were traditionally underserved. So we're looking, the division between social emotional learning and character education and where they were showing up was very racially and class-based. And we were seeing with the character education, also lining up a lot more with no excuses charter schools. Are you familiar with that approach or term? Okay, so some yeses and some nos. Some of the kind of grew out of the KIPP network as an example, and kind of grew out of Teach for America, and the idea that somewhat militaristic approach, which that's being a little heavy-handed. Charter schools that have a real emphasis on kind of following rules, like extreme, if you had like uniforms heavily enforced, that often there's kind of walking silently in the hallways, and primarily these schools are, again, in communities that have not historically been served well by the educational system, but what they're finding is that social emotional learning programs that were more either explorative or about kind of creating this culture in this community were showing up more in more affluent areas, and character education, and this isn't like all over the place, but just in terms of really looking like on a broad scale nationally where these are popping up in different areas, and then character education was showing up more in schools that were serving underserved communities. And so you're really getting this differential experience. On one hand, and social emotional learning programs could also be very didactic and top-down. But there was, and there is, a lot more being written now about the concern that idea of grit or resilience is another way to kind of put the onus back on the individual and not account for social and contextual factors, social and cultural context and kind of the history of systemic racism and classism, and kind of just the idea being that it's like no matter what you've gone through or what else is happening, as long as you have grit, you can get through it, and kind of back to the idea of meritocracy and that fun stuff. So I think that's like, it's a fascinating comparison to look at those approaches, and we'll do a little with it in terms of when we compare like social emotional learning to all of those, like school climate and character education, but that would be a really fascinating, amazing thing if that's something like that was interesting you, that you wanted to explore in your paper. That would be really cool. I'm trying to stop myself because I have a lot to say about grit, but I'm curious what your thoughts are, your experiences are.
Sounds a little like social Darwinism. I'm a sociologist, and reminds me of like some of the early sociologists, Herbert Spencer, that used to try to prove that certain cultures were inferior. And so is that sort of an effort to address the shortfalls of what people perceive to be of particular groups?
I would
know enough about it to speak to that, but that's what it sounds a little bit like, as opposed to this being more of an exploration of self.
Right.
How to navigate through the world.
I tend to think of it, as a little bit like, I agree that it's that with the grit narrative is that despite everything that's going on around you, that just takes a very individualistic approach to self, and that you determine what happens, and it doesn't take into account the context and the history. And I think as a part of that, also creates an excuse, in the sense that it's like, okay, well, if all that matters is one's individual grit and perseverance and resilience, then we don't really need to worry about issues of school funding, and we don't, you know, because it's all, yeah.
The Paul Tufts book, How Children Succeed,
Yep.
You know, was a bestseller.
Yep.
He's really writing about both ends of the spectrum. I mean, he's also talking about very privileged children whose parents never allowed them to fail, and how damaging that is for them. And I think he's also trying to get across that we can't have no safety net for kids who are in these impacted communities. That grit doesn't mean, I don't think he means that grit means you can just deal with whatever, but that we need support for these kids so that they can develop resilience. I don't know. I just see that really a little bit differently. Like, I don't think it's just like either you have grit or you don't. I think it's more like we need to create community support so that kids can be resilient. I don't know.
Yeah. No, and I think that's, I think there's a lot of different ways that grit has been taken up, and I think that the intention and the original intention with like Angela Duckworth's work and is the idea of teaching it, and I think that, you know, the idea of having resilience is great. I think I just worry about who we're directing that instruction to and what specific populations and kind of that unfortunately I think it has taken on a life of its own in that if we look only in that it provides a way for us to look just at grit and just at the individual without providing, I think grit is great if it's surrounded by other supports. Still thinking about issues of school funding, still thinking about community context, and I worry that when it gets just reduced to grit, I guess, is that's when I get concerned. But I think if it's a piece of a much bigger puzzle, I think that that's great, because having, you know, being able to bounce back is a good thing, but I think we also need to question who we're asking to bounce back and what we're asking them to bounce back from. But that's, yeah. But I think that happens with a lot of things. The intention of something when you put it out, like the idea of grit, and then where people take it is, and I think, you know, it happens with all social emotional learning too. I think that there are some programs out there that I read and I question, like, you know, are we really getting at the true intention of social emotional learning here? Is this what we set out to do? And sometimes it can just become another like scripted part of the curriculum, which is a bummer. But since we're on this, are there other kind of things that are related to social emotional learning that have kind of come up for you, like around grit and character education? Are there other areas that would be worth touching on while we're here?
At this conference that we went to, you may want to comment more on this, but the police department and SEL and what's happening like in Cleveland, just in terms of, there's so many, I guess being at that conference, I was thinking of SEL just in terms of what's happening in the school system, but to see cities adopting SEL in a much broader context was really pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And the superintendent of Cleveland that's implemented it in 87 schools, and just in terms of violence reduction and some of the things that we're talking about related to the police department were pretty interesting, I thought.
Yeah, that was a fascinating, it was a conference we were both at, I don't know, a few weeks ago that, before we knew each other, so we didn't even know the other person was there, that was talking, and one of the speakers, yes, was the superintendent of the Cleveland School District that had really been involved with the Turnaround Project, and really just, yeah, fascinating discussion of how social emotional learning really is not just about the individual, but a community effort and extending beyond the schools. So, any other thoughts, ideas about kind of other programmatic efforts? The other one I can think of that comes to mind off the top of my head is kind of school climate and school culture issues intersects a lot. So if anyone had any thoughts on that or anything they wanted to share or discuss. If not, we could move towards trying, now that we've kind of gone through all these pieces and talked a little bit more about how the definition of social emotional learning has changed slightly over the last 20 years across the research base, maybe trying to explore our own definitions of social emotional learning. So I did add on to the Google Doc a section for if we want to kind of look at that and defining it there. I also brought colored paper and marker, which I'm sorry I can't share with you virtually. If you feel like this is something that would be easier expressed in a drawing than with words. But I think it would be great if we could spend, let's see, gosh, we don't have too much time left. It's about 4 o'clock, so we could spend, let's see, about 10 minutes maybe, let's say, either individually or in small groups, and either adding onto the Google Doc or drawing or just writing yourself an idea of what is social emotional learning? Like trying to come up with either our own definitions in small groups and then bringing those together so that we can maybe have a working definition going forward for the class. I realize that as we move towards the paper, we'll be using kind of our own modified definitions and how it fits in our particular context. But I think it would be great if we could come up with something that we're working from the same lens or framework of, at least in terms of the class, when we say social emotional learning, what it is we're trying to get to. So, yeah, let's come back together. Yeah, sorry.
Speaking of the paper, before class gets out, can we talk about your expectations for the draft 1?
Yes, so we will touch on it. We will touch on that at the end of class when we kind of talk about for next week. And I will send you, sorry, I had a doctor's appointment that was supposed to be this afternoon, moved to this morning, so I didn't write up another piece, but I will send you that tomorrow, like an expanded brief about what we're looking at. But do keep in mind also that it's a draft. This is not graded. This is like kind of our first entry into the paper. But I'll send you by tomorrow, a write-up about kind of what I'm hoping for this for you. But with both of this assignment and the presentation, it's really, we have people in this class from a lot of different backgrounds and are hoping to use social emotional learning in very different ways. So as much as possible, I wanted to keep it really broad so that it can be personalized for you. So I will send out a description, kind of an overarching description, but I'm happy to like talk with anyone over the phone, over email, in person. I love coffee, to talk about kind of how it fits for you in your specific context too. So. But yes, we will definitely touch on that. So it's 4 o'clock. Let's spend like about 10 minutes, either individually or in groups, processing what we are kind of moving towards in terms of a definition of social emotional learning. And then we'll come back together and kind of share those and talk about what we're headed towards next week. And I do have markers and paper. All right, let's come back together, and I'd love to hear kind of what came up for you. What was, not only what maybe your definitions were or what your pictures are, but what was challenging about this? Where did you get stuck as you were trying to define it? Like what?
It was challenging because there's so many definitions already out there.
Yeah.
Like how do I make it different? Do I draw from each of them?
That's a great, yeah.
Yeah, and you could also go so deep into it. I think that was the challenging thing. Like, where do you stop with the definition? Because it can be a really long definition.
You could write a paper about it, yeah. Other thoughts about either challenges or kind of where you ended up? How did pictures go for people that decided to go the pictorial route? Was that challenging, or did that feel a little easier?
I think it kind of helped me think through, because I'm not a wordsmith.
Yeah.
It helped me think through, I guess, a way of describing it a little bit better. I don't know. Yeah. Just in my own mind, it just helped me process a little bit more concise.
Great.
With the image versus words, because like I was saying, like it could go forever, but the image kind of encapsulated all of it for me.
Okay. Cool.
So I kind of stole Jordan's idea. I loved what he said about like the nebulous and how it all is interacting together. So I don't know, you can't really see.
Oh, you could come up here though if you want to. If you want to show your artwork.
Maybe take a picture of it and put it in the Google.
Okay. Did anyone jump on the Google Doc and do that route instead with the verbal? It's totally fine if not. I was just curious.
I was planning on adding to it eventually.
Okay. Cool. So how are you feeling with this? Like, do you feel like you're in a space where you're working towards a definition that might work for you in your context? Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Or since we have a few minutes in this space here, that you want to bounce ideas off each other before we head off for the weekend?
Online, we kind of talked about the importance of the word care, that in Elias's definition, they said that SEL is a process through which we learn to recognize and manage emotions, care about others, make good decisions, etc. And that in the Castle definition, there's not such a focus on care, but on, and then whether that's important or, and we just, I don't know, we didn't come to a conclusion, but that we thought that you can, have a good social interaction and develop, relationships, but without that care component. We didn't talk about whether, it should be in there, but anyway, what does everybody else think? Do we need that care in there, or is it enough to just like treat each other with respect?
That's a great question. I mean, it definitely makes me think of kind of the Nell Noddings approach with the care as a focal point. But yeah, what do you guys think? Is for social emotional learning, kind of broadly, what role does caring play?
I think it plays a big role. You can act in a respectful way, and it can be completely insincere. And you have to play the game. And I think it's important to try to foster caring and show caring. I mean, that's just my feeling about it.
Yeah.
I mean, really within a professional context, you can show caring just by listening, like doing active listening. You don't necessarily have to find out about their weekend or their mom or anything, but I mean, you can definitely show caring through just actively listening when they're expressing angst about a project or about a situation, and maybe that's redefining the word care could be what we're coming up against right now.
And to a degree, I feel like I could do short-term care. Like I can listen effectively and try and talk. If you're having an issue or something, listen to it. But I don't know. For me, if I really care about a topic or care about someone or care, then it goes beyond just that conversation right there. So I wonder. I guess it is. It's just another definition of care. Is the depth of care. I definitely think in a professional setting, maybe care is different than in an educational setting or in a relationship. In that you would have to your family members or something.
Doorbell.
Sorry, no, that's My baby's crying.
Oh. Oh.
Alarm for that. I might need to go see it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that like a thing now?
I don't know. I thought it was a doorbell.
I thought it was a doorbell. Yes, I didn't.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. The textbook at the beginning uses the words knowledgeable, responsible, caring.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about for children to become caring, they must be able to see beyond themselves and appreciate the concerns of others. They must believe that to care is to be part of a community that is welcoming, nurturing, and concerned about them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this idea of care is embedded in the social awareness.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we were sort of touching on here is what is really, what those 5 competencies, what does each of them involve? Because, and I've forgotten your name. Oh, you were talking about social justice, and being concerned about issues of equality and things like that, and where does that fit in?
Yeah.
Because I think we all think that's important. But anyway, so is it in there already, I guess?
Yeah. That's a great point. Like, is it already embedded in the competencies, but just not specifically stated as care on its own, but it's a part of, that makes sense.
Maybe just another word for care is just to be invested. Because I think when I think of the kids that are more successful in school, that's the difference, is that they are invested in why they're there.
And it makes me think back to what you were talking earlier about the student perception surveys. And, one of the questions that on there, and I think that has had some misinterpretation around it, is, does my teacher care about me? Because it's like, how are we defining what you mean by care? And how are students interpreting that? I think student perception surveys are fascinating and wonderful to be able to look at on your own, but I personally get concerned about their use for in terms of determining the effectiveness of teachers' rating. Okay, so let's touch base on what we're doing for next week. So for Tuesday, we're looking at what is the relationship between theory, research, and practice in social emotional learning, which I think so far we've kind of looked at the theory, or at least some of the theory behind it. We'll expand on that a little bit. We really dug into the one major research study, and now we're kind of starting to move into the role of questioning how we can really apply this to our own practice, how we can determine as we move towards researching our own programs, what are effective social emotional learning practices and programs, and how can we, as we start to dig into the hundreds of programs that are on the market, how, in addition to looking at like the research or evidence base about those programs, how can we start to discern what we think will be effective for us in our given situation? So, in terms of reading, we have 2 chapters from the new handbook, the new social emotional learning handbook. We have 1 chapter from this kind of our original text, and then 1 that's online on D2L. I also wanted to touch base, we kind of already discussed it, but I will send out an email expanding on the description for the draft. But really, especially since this is the first draft, we're going to be doing it in 3 parts. Please, I also want you to feel free to kind of explore with this one a bit, because this is basically the chance for us to start having a conversation about what you're thinking about what social emotional learning is and how you want to apply it in your own context, in your own circumstances. I kind of think of this as like the first chance for me to get, I mean, I know we have all introduced ourselves around the room, but for me to get a sense of where you're hoping to kind of put this into. So whether it's your classroom or somewhere else entirely what you're hoping to do with your new understanding of social emotional learning. So I will send that around tomorrow, but please, I just don't want you to also feel beholden to this in a certain way. If you want to go in a different direction or want to explore something new, this would be a good chance for us to get that conversation started. I will also send out, I'll create a Google Doc so that you can, and send out to everyone so that you can sign up for a day that works for you in terms of the discussion leaders. So we have, like, oh gosh, 6, 8, I don't know, 8 more, no, I don't know. I'll create a Google Doc that has the dates available for the discussion leader signups and then spaces underneath so you can pick one that works for you. And any other questions? Yeah, thanks.
Do we need these printed for Tuesday, or will they go electronically, or?
For which? I'm sorry. The drafts. No. What? And is the draft for Tuesday or Wednesday?
Tuesday, because Wednesday,
7 p.m.
You're it.
Yes, but I thought, okay. Sorry, just want to, oh, so I did say. Oh, yeah, but it's Tuesday, yeah, sorry, Tuesday, by 7 so that you guys can, okay, perfect. Okay, so yes, you do not need to have it in class, and what I'm going to do is in terms of distributing it to me, there's a Dropbox on D2L under, I can pull it up. Thank you. Under assessments, there's a space that's Dropbox, and it's labeled draft 1 of the paper, and put that in there. And in class on Tuesday, I'll circulate kind of preliminary writing groups so that you have a few people in the class to also bounce ideas off of, and you can just I'll have the email list, so you can just circulate to each other via email. And then the idea being, since we do not meet on Wednesday, during that time period at some point on Wednesday, that you can read and respond to the other person's drafts and give them some ideas about where to go from there. And then I will do the same that weekend and have the drafts back to you next week. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah.
I know that you don't like page requirements, so what's your idea for the length for Tuesday?
No, it's totally, I mean, so what I was thinking for this piece is that you kind of dig into what social emotional learning is and then start to think about like the second part, which is like what's its role going to be relative to me. I mean, I think if you're aiming for the kind of 15 to 25 pages for the overall part, that this part you'd spend a few pages defining what social emotional learning is like to you and what you're basing that off of. You know, it's like, okay, I'm starting with, I still don't know how to say his last name, Elias's definition, and I'm modifying it this way because, and then starting to talk about your circumstance. So, I mean, I would think,
Is it like the first third of the paper?
I mean, that's kind of almost what I think about it as, if that works for you. I would think that, I don't know, 5 or 6 pages but don't feel like, I don't know, everyone works at different paces too, so I think that, you know, maybe you might have 10 or 12 if you like really gung-ho on, or you might have less than that, and that's fine. So, I mean, I would say a minimum of 3 to 4 pages, and if you want to go beyond that, that's great. But it's also, you could also kind of, because it's split apart into kind of 3 areas, I mean, basically, whatever work you do this time, you will have less to do the next time, or if you do less on this end, you'll have more to do in the second draft. But please divide it as it makes sense to you, both in terms of your schedule and commitments and in terms of how it makes sense to you cognitively to divide it up. Other questions? Cool. thank you for a wonderful first week of class and for bearing with me as I learned the technology. So thank you so much. Have a fabulous 4-day weekend, and yeah, I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you. Have a happy birthday, Ethan.